He is the most feared man in Seoul, a man who built an empire on silence, obedience, and the kind of violence people only whisper about. She is the woman he married 2 years ago and never once truly looked at. For 2 years, they lived under the same roof like strangers. No shared mornings, no real conversations, only cold, suffocating silence that hurt worse than any words. But tonight, at the most prestigious charity gala in the city, one man looks at his wife the way Jae-hyun never allowed himself to. And everything he buried alive begins to claw its way back to the surface. Like this video, comment your city below and follow till the very end, because this story is only just beginning. The ballroom was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small. Chandeliers the size of small automobiles hung from a vaulted ceiling trimmed in brushed gold. The floors were white marble, polished until they reflected the faces of Seoul's most powerful back at themselves in distorted, flattering angles. Waitstaff moved through the crowd like shadows, trained, invisible, replaceable. The guests were anything but invisible. Politicians in Italian suits, corporate executives whose handshakes moved markets. And seated at carefully arranged tables throughout the room, the men whose names never appeared in newspaper headlines, but whose decisions shaped everything that did. Kang Jae-hyun stood near the far wall with a glass of single malt whiskey he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He was 41 years old, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation, with a face that had been called handsome so many times he'd stopped hearing it. He wore a black tuxedo with no decoration, no pocket square, no cufflinks that announced themselves. Everything about him was calibrated to signal exactly one thing. I don't need your attention. I already have your fear. It worked. It always worked. The men who passed him offered careful nods. The women who passed him offered careful smiles. No one lingered. No one touched his arm or leaned in to share a joke. Even the men he'd known for 20 years kept a precise, instinctive distance, like animals that had learned where the invisible fence was buried. He didn't mind. He had stopped minding a long time ago. What he minded, what had been pulling at the edge of his attention for the last 40 minutes like a splinter he couldn't reach, was standing across the ballroom in a dark green gown. Amara, his wife. She was laughing at something the man beside her had said, her head tilting back just slightly, one hand resting on the stem of her champagne flute. The laugh was real. He could tell the difference. In 2 years of living in the same house, eating at the same table, occupying the same carefully divided spaces, he had cataloged every version of Amara Bennett's expressions without ever meaning to. The polite smile she used for his business associates, the flat, neutral look she wore during their rare obligatory dinners, the quiet, unguarded expression she wore on Sunday mornings when she thought no one was watching, sitting by the window in the east sitting room with a book open in her lap, and the Seoul skyline dissolving into fog behind the glass. This laugh was the real one. He hadn't seen it in months. The man beside her was Park Sung-jin, 53, self-made tech billionaire, twice divorced, currently working his way through a midlife renovation that included a new wardrobe, a personal trainer, and apparently an interest in other men's wives. Jae-hyun knew everything about him that mattered: net worth, leverage points, current political affiliations, and the fact that his second divorce had been ugly enough that 2 of Jae-hyun's lieutenants had been approached to provide certain services that Jae-hyun had declined to authorize. He was not a dangerous man. He was the more irritating kind, a man who had money and charm and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who truly mattered. Jae-hyun watched him lean toward Amara and say something that made her smile again. Not the polite one, the real one. He took a slow sip of whiskey. The burn didn't help. Across the room, Amara felt the weight of it before she saw him looking. That was the thing about Jae-hyun. He looked at nothing the way other people looked at things. Other men stared. They let their gaze linger, let you know you were being observed. Jae-hyun simply directed his attention somewhere and the air changed. 2 years of living with him had taught her to feel it the way you feel a drop in barometric pressure before rain. Something quiet and certain and impossible to ignore. She didn't turn her head. She kept her expression steady, kept her attention on Park Sung-jin, who was currently explaining his recent acquisition of a resort property on Jeju Island with the cheerful self-satisfaction of a man who expected his accomplishments to land as foreplay. You'd love it, he was telling her. The East Wing has a private beach, completely secluded. I had the whole thing redesigned last spring. He paused, swirling his champagne. Actually, I keep saying I should host a dinner there. Intimate. 20 people, maybe 30. The kind of evening where you actually remember the conversations the next morning. That sounds lovely, Amara said, because it was the kind of response the moment required. Non-committal, warm enough to be polite. You should come, Sung-jin smiled. Both of you, obviously. Though I'll be honest, and here his tone shifted slightly, taking on the playful edge of a man testing water temperature. Your husband isn't exactly known for his dinner conversation. Amara kept her expression neutral. He's a private person. Private. Sung-jin seemed to find this diplomatic. That's one word for it. He glanced across the room, Jae-hyun's direction, and then back to her, and something shifted in his expression. Appreciation, unguarded and direct. I have to say, Mrs. Kang, and forgive me, I mean this as a genuine compliment. You are by a considerable margin the most interesting person in this room tonight. You haven't spoken to everyone in the room. I don't need to. He said it simply, like it was just a fact. I've been coming to these events for 15 years. I know exactly what I'll find. And then you walk in and I'm reminded that occasionally the universe still surprises you. He tilted his champagne glass slightly toward her. If you weren't already married, I'd have proposed by the end of the evening. I'm completely serious. He said it with enough lightness that the three people standing nearby caught it and laughed. A small, rippling sound that spread outward like something dropped into still water. Amara smiled. It was the polite one this time. And from across the room, Kang Jae-hyun heard the laughter. He set his whiskey glass down on a passing server's tray without looking at it. He didn't move toward her. Not immediately. He stood where he was for another 30 seconds. Long enough that no one watching would have read urgency into what happened next. And then he crossed the ballroom with the particular unhurried stride of a man who had never once needed to rush toward anything because everything eventually came to him. He arrived at Amara's side without announcement. He didn't touch her. He simply appeared at her shoulder the way weather appears. Suddenly present, impossible to ignore. Park Sung-jin saw him first. The warmth in the older man's expression didn't disappear exactly, but it reorganized itself into something more careful. Jae-hyun, he extended his hand. I was just telling your wife what an extraordinary woman she is. I heard. Jae-hyun shook his hand. His grip was measured. His voice was measured. Everything about him was always measured. You were proposing. Sung-jin laughed, reaching for levity. Hypothetically, a man can dream. The people nearby laughed again, softer this time, nervous at the edges. Jae-hyun didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He simply looked at Park Sung-jin with the same expression he used when reviewing documents he intended to sign. Thorough, unimpressed, and completely certain of the outcome. Then, without looking at her, without a word, he placed his hand on the small of Amara's back. It was barely a touch, palm flat, fingers spread. He'd probably touched more than 1,000 people in his life with less intention. But the warmth of it moved through the fabric of her gown and landed against her spine like something that had been building pressure for 2 years and finally found a crack to move through. Amara went very still. Sung-jin noticed, everyone nearby noticed. The conversation reshaped itself, moved to safer territory, and within 4 minutes the small cluster had dispersed with the gentle efficiency of people who understood when a moment had ended. Jae-hyun removed his hand. He picked up a fresh glass of whiskey from a passing tray. He did not look at Amara. She looked at him. Thank you, she said quietly. Careful. Testing. For what? Not a question, flat. For coming over. He said nothing. She turned back to the room, champagne flute at her lips, and decided, not for the first time, not for the 100th, that she would never understand this man she had married. The rest of the evening passed the way these evenings always did. Careful performances executed by practiced people. Jae-hyun moved through the room with his usual economy, speaking only when approached, offering only what each conversation required. He met with 3 men in quick succession near the bar. Low voices, no visible tension, the kind of exchanges that looked like small talk and weren't. Amara watched him from a distance, the way she always did at these events, trying to read the architecture of him, trying to find the place where the public version ended and whatever was underneath began. She had been trying for 2 years. She had not yet found it. Amara Bennett had grown up in Atlanta, the youngest daughter of a surgeon father and a mother who taught literature at a state university and believed deeply in the moral weight of stories. She had been raised to be direct, intellectually rigorous, and deeply suspicious of people who communicated in implication rather than words. She had a graduate degree in international development from Georgetown, 3 years of NGO work in Southeast Asia, and a laugh that her college roommate had once described as the kind that makes strangers want to introduce themselves. None of it had prepared her for Kang Jae-hyun. She had known about him before she met him, known about the family, the empire, the careful interlocking network of legitimate business holdings that sat above the waterline while the real structure existed entirely below it. Her own family had connections. Her father's older brother had built a small but durable import-export business in Seoul over 30 years, and it was through those connections, those careful social circles, that the Kang family had identified her. That was how her mother had explained it, in the careful, oblique language her family used for things that didn't have clean explanations. "They're a serious family," her mother had said, "and they're looking for someone serious." What they were actually looking for, Amara had understood later, was stability. Jaehyun's father had died 18 months earlier, and the transition of power within the Kang organization had created certain vulnerabilities that a marriage, the right marriage, could help address. A union with a family that had legitimate international ties. A wife who was educated, composed, and unlikely to become a liability. She had agreed to it. That part was the hardest to explain to people who didn't live inside the particular web of obligation and loyalty she'd grown up navigating. She had agreed to it because her uncle asked her to, because her uncle was 70 years old and had built his entire life in Korea and had called her, voice rough with something she'd never heard in it before, and said the words, "I need this, Amara." And she had found that she could not say no to him. She had told herself it would be a year, maybe 2, long enough to stabilize whatever needed stabilizing, and then a quiet, dignified exit, a settlement, an arrangement maintained at respectful distance. She had not told herself she would fall in love with Seoul, or with the silence of early mornings in the Kang estate, when the whole city was still gray and soft, and the gardener moved through the grounds below her window with the unhurried patience of someone who understood that growth could not be rushed. She had not told herself she would begin to feel, somewhere around the 8-month mark, that leaving would involve a kind of tearing, and she had absolutely not told herself anything at all about Kang Jae-hyun. The car arrived at 11:15. They rode home in the back of a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver named Dae Jung, who had worked for Jae-hyun for 11 years and had long since developed the particular professional skill of existing without being present. The city moved past the windows, neon, concrete, the articulated glow of a million lives compressed into vertical space. 40 minutes. Jaehyun sat on his side of the seat. Amara sat on hers. The distance between them was not large, perhaps 18 inches, but it had the texture of something much greater. He had his phone out within the first 5 minutes. She watched the window. She was used to this. The drive home from events had its own established grammar. Whatever performance was required in public was set down in the car, and by the time they reached the estate, the evening was over, filed away, neither discussed nor dissected. They were good at the parallel existence. They had been practicing it for 2 years. But something was different tonight. She could feel it in the quality of his silence, in the way he was holding his phone without actually reading whatever was on the screen, in the tension across his shoulders that she could see even from her side of the seat, even without looking directly at him. She watched Seoul blur past the window and said nothing. The estate was 40 minutes north of the city center, set back from a private road behind stone walls that had been built to last longer than anyone currently living. The main house was 3 stories, modern in its renovation, but with bones that went back over 100 years. There were gardens, a staff residence, a detached building that served as Jae-hyun's primary office. At this hour, the grounds were quiet, lit by low pathway lights that turned the manicured lawn a pale silver green. Dae-young pulled through the gate. The car came to a stop at the main entrance. Amara had her door open before the vehicle fully stopped. Old habit. She had learned early that waiting to be helped out of vehicles created a specific kind of charged moment she preferred to avoid. She crossed the entrance steps and was through the front door before Jae-hyun reached the top. Git. The house was quiet. The night staff had left the entry hall lit and retreated. Amara crossed the marble floor toward the staircase, heels clicking in the emptiness, unwinding the thin wrap from her shoulders as she walked. His offer wasn't hypothetical. She stopped. She turned around slowly. Jaehyun was still near the entrance, jacket open, hands at his sides. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. Not anger exactly. Something rawer than anger. Something that looked like a man who had just put his hand on a hot surface and was processing the sensation before deciding what it meant. "Excuse me?" she said. "Park Sung-jin." His voice was even, controlled. The control was its own kind of tell. He wasn't joking. Amara looked at him. He was making conversation. He was telling you he wanted you. Flat. Direct. In front of 30 people and your husband. The word landed oddly. Husband. He so rarely used it. In 2 years, she could count on one hand the times he'd referred to her as his wife in private, when there was no audience to perform for. "And?" she said. Something moved through his expression. He didn't answer immediately, which was itself unusual. Jae-hyun was a man who always had an answer. She had watched him face down men twice his size and men 10 times his power with the same unruffled economy of language. Silence from him was never uncertainty. It was always deliberate. This felt different. "I didn't like it," he said finally. "You didn't like it," she repeated carefully. "No." "You didn't like a man paying me a compliment." His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of intent. He was joking, Jaehyun. He wasn't. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had spent 20 years reading rooms for threat. "I know the difference." Amara held his gaze. The entry hall stretched between them, wide and white and impossibly quiet, and she felt something shifting in the air. A pressure change, like the ballroom but more concentrated, more honest somehow, stripped of the performance and the crowd. "Why do you care?" she asked. And that was the question that cracked something open. He didn't answer it. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his eyes that she had never seen there before, something that looked almost like vulnerability, which was so far outside her understanding of Kang Jae-hyun that she wasn't sure she was reading it correctly. Then he said, "Good night, Amara," and walked past her toward his study. She stood in the entry hall alone. Her heart was doing something complicated. She stood there for a full minute after she heard his study door close, the wrap bunched in her hands, the chandelier light making everything look slightly unreal, slightly too sharp at the edges. Then she walked upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the opposite wall and tried to name what she was feeling. She couldn't. She had gotten very good at not being able to name it. She had arrived in this house 2 years ago with 3 suitcases and the clean, self-protective certainty that this was a transaction, an obligation fulfilled, a favor given to the uncle she loved, wrapped in a legal agreement she would honor with dignity and exit with her sense of self intact. She had not packed anything she wasn't prepared to leave behind. She had not allowed herself to need anything she might not be able to keep. She had been careful. She had been so careful. And somewhere in the careful management of the thing, in the Sunday mornings by the window, and the meals eaten in parallel silence, and the nights she could hear him moving through the house when neither of them could sleep. She had become something she hadn't planned. She had become attached. Not to the idea of him, not to the estate or the safety or the life. To him, to the specific, frustrating, controlled, unknowable human being who left tea outside her door when she was sick without knocking, who corrected his staff when they spoke over her in meetings, who had once, just once in the early months, paused outside her open door when she was playing music too loud, and stood there for almost 30 seconds before walking away, and she had never asked him why. She had never asked him anything that mattered, and tonight he had placed his hand on her back and looked at another man without a single word, and somehow communicated something that had rearranged the air in the room, and then he had stood in the entry hall of their house and said, "I didn't like it," like a man who had just made a confession he didn't have language for yet. Amara pressed her palms flat against the bedspread. Downstairs in his study she could hear, faintly, barely, the sound of a chair being pulled back, the soft, controlled sounds of a man moving through a room. She thought about going down. She didn't go down. She lay back on the bed in her green gown and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house breathe around her and thought about the way his hand had felt against her spine and told herself firmly that she was reading too much into a single gesture from a man who communicated in gestures because words cost him something she hadn't earned the right to yet. She fell asleep without changing, which was not like her. She dreamed of the ballroom, the chandeliers, the laughter, the weight of a hand she could still feel. 3 days passed. They were strange days, ordinary on the surface, the usual architecture of parallel lives, but with something underneath that had changed its texture. She felt it most at meals. Breakfast was a solitary affair by long-established habit. They had never coordinated mornings. Dinner, when they shared it, which was perhaps 3 or 4 times a week, had always operated under the same unspoken rules. Neutral topics, efficient exchanges, no sustained eye contact. On the first evening after the gala, he was already at the table when she came down. She had prepared herself for the usual calibrated distance. She sat across from him, poured her water, unfolded her napkin. He said, "How was your afternoon?" She looked up. "Fine," she said, carefully. "You were at the foundation?" She worked 3 days a week with an international development foundation operating programs across Southeast Asia. It was the closest thing she had to her former life, to the work she had done before Seoul, and she had negotiated it as one of her only firm requirements when the arrangement was made. It had taken her 4 months to realize that Jae-hyun had not merely permitted it. He had, without telling her, arranged for 3 specific funding introductions that had materially expanded the foundation's operating budget. She had found out from the foundation's director, not from him. "Yes," she said, "the Cambodia project." He said it like he knew about it, which, of course, he did. She had understood for some time that Jae-hyun Kang knew approximately everything that moved through his household. The funding gap. "We're close to resolving it." He nodded, turned his attention to his food. Amara watched him for a moment. "You knew about the gap," she said. He didn't look up. "I'm aware of most things." "Did you—" She stopped. He looked up then, waiting. "Did you speak to the Cho Foundation on our behalf?" she asked. Director Lim mentioned a contact, someone who made an introduction. A pause. The kind of pause that, with Jae-hyun, told you something. "I know people there." "You didn't tell me. You didn't ask." She held his gaze. "I'm asking now." Something in his face, something small and quick that she almost missed. "Yes," he said. "I made a call." She didn't say thank you. She had learned that thank you landed awkwardly with him, like a formality he didn't know how to receive. She just held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her plate, and the silence between them was different from the usual silence. It had a warmer quality, less like absence and more like the space between sentences in a conversation that had not yet finished. On the second day, she came home to find a book on the entry hall table. A new biography of a Kenyan economist whose work she had mentioned exactly once, 6 months ago, in a phone call she had not known he was within earshot of. There was no note. There was never a note. She picked it up and stood in the entry hall for a long moment. Then she took it upstairs and put it on her nightstand and tried not to make it mean more than it meant. On the third day, she ran into him in the garden at 7 in the morning. This was unprecedented. In 2 years, she had never seen him in the garden before 8, and usually not before 9. He was standing near the eastern wall where the climbing roses had been planted. Old roses, pale coral, the kind that looks slightly wild even when tended. With a cup of coffee in one hand and his other hand in his jacket pocket, looking at something she couldn't identify. She stopped on the path. He heard her. She knew he heard everything, but he didn't turn immediately. "You're up early," she said. "I didn't sleep well." It was the most personal thing he had said to her in months. She stood on the path with the morning cold in her lungs and the city a low, distant sound behind the walls. And she looked at the line of his shoulders and the set of his jaw in profile and thought, something has changed, something is different. And she didn't know whether to move toward it or away from it, whether to name it or leave it unnamed and see what it became on its own. "The roses are almost finished for the season," she said finally. "Yes." He looked at them. "They'll come back." She didn't know why that felt like it meant something else entirely. She walked past him toward the far end of the garden, and she could feel him watching her go, and she kept her pace steady and her shoulders level and her breathing even, the way she had trained herself to move through every single day inside this house. And she thought, how much longer can I do this? How much longer before one of them finally says the thing that neither of them has said? That night, past midnight, when the house had settled into its deep quiet, and she was lying awake with the book open on her chest, and her mind somewhere else entirely, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door. They stopped. Right outside her door, they stopped. She lay absolutely still. She counted to 10. Then she heard, quiet and deliberate and impossible to mistake for anything accidental, a knock. Her heart moved in her chest in a way she hadn't prepared for. She sat up, pushed the book aside, looked at the door. "Come in," she said. The handle turned. The door opened slowly. Jae-hyun stood in the frame with his jacket gone, his shirt collar open at the throat, his sleeves rolled to the forearm. He looked like a man who had spent 3 hours arguing with himself and lost. His hair was slightly displaced, the careful order of it undone by whatever he'd been doing in his study, running his hand through it most likely, which she had seen him do exactly once before during a phone call that had gone badly. And the memory of it had stayed with her longer than it should have. He looked at her sitting up in bed with the book on the coverlet and the lamp throwing warm light across her face, and something moved through his expression that he didn't try to hide. That was the thing that stopped her breath. He wasn't hiding it. For the first time in 2 years, Kang Jae-hyun was standing in front of her and not hiding something. "I need to say something," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges in a way it never was in public. Amara folded her hands in her lap. "Okay." He didn't move into the room. He stayed in the frame, one hand on the door, like he was preserving the option of retreat. "The other night, at the gala." "Yes." "I handled it badly." She waited. "When I came over, the way I—" He stopped, pressed his jaw closed for a moment. "I didn't ask you. I just moved in and put my hands on you like you were something I had a right to claim in front of people, and I didn't ask." Amara looked at him carefully. "I wasn't offended. That's not the point." Something sharpened in his voice. Not at her. She had learned to read the direction of his tension. This was at himself. "The point is that I did it because I wanted to, not for appearances, not because the situation required it." A pause. "Because another man was looking at you and I—" He stopped again, looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "I didn't like it." "You said that. I know what I said." His hand tightened on the doorframe. "I'm saying more than that now." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere far below the estate walls, a car moved through the night. A distant sound. Then nothing. "Then say it," Amara said, quietly. Not a challenge, an opening. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight caught the angle of his face, the line of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who controlled everything in his life except, apparently, this. "I don't know how," he said. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She exhaled slowly, moved to the edge of the bed, feet finding the floor. She didn't stand. She just sat at the edge, closer to him now, and looked at him directly the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in months, because it always cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. "Sit down," she said, "please." He looked at the chair near the window, the small reading chair she'd had moved up from one of the downstairs rooms 8 months ago, the one that had gradually accumulated a stack of books on its arm that she kept meaning to reorganize. He crossed the room and sat in it with the careful deliberateness of a man operating in unfamiliar territory. His forearms came down on his knees. He looked at her. "How long," she said, "have we been doing this?" 2 years. "How long have we been doing it badly?" A beat. 2 years. Something almost like a laugh moved through her. Not funny. The other kind. The kind that lives right next to the thing that hurts. "I thought you didn't want me here," she said. Flat, direct. She had made a decision somewhere between hearing the knock and saying come in that if he was going to be honest, she would match it. "Not personally. I knew the arrangement, I understood the structure. But I thought that beyond the arrangement, beyond what the families needed, you found me inconvenient, an obligation you were honoring out of duty. His eyes didn't move from her face. No. Then what? His jaw worked for a moment. I thought you needed space. Space? She said it like a word she was turning over to look at the underside of. You didn't choose this. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. You came here because your uncle asked you to. You left your life, your work, your city, everything you'd built, and you came here to marry a man you'd met 3 times. I thought the least I could do was not— He stopped. Not make it worse by pushing. Amara stared at him. You were being considerate, she said slowly. I was trying to be. For 2 years. Yes. Jae-hyun. She pressed her palms together, fingertips touching. I spent 6 months convinced you regretted it. That you'd looked at me across a dinner table and calculated what you'd agreed to and found the math disappointing. She watched his face. I spent the next 6 months figuring out how to be invisible enough that at least I wasn't making it worse. Something crossed his face, fast and sharp, like a flinch. And then, she continued, I spent the following year trying to stop thinking about it at all, trying to just— She opened her hands. Live in it, accept it, make something functional out of what we had. Amara, I'm not finished. Not unkind, but certain. I need you to understand what I'm telling you. I was not suffering. I want to be clear about that. I made my peace with it. I have a life here, work I care about, and I'd stopped waiting for— She paused. I'd stopped waiting. He was very still. And then you put your hand on my back, she said, in a room full of people. And you looked at Park Sung-jin the way you look at things you've decided are problems, and I felt— She stopped, looked down at her hands. I didn't know what to do with it. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, the kind that has weight and heat and direction. I shouldn't have waited, he said. No. I thought I was protecting you. I know. She looked up. That's the part that makes me— She pressed her lips together, something moving behind her eyes that she hadn't decided yet whether to let through. You were trying to protect me by staying away. And I was trying not to be a burden by staying away. And we were both so careful and so— The word she wanted was stupid, but she didn't say it. We wasted 2 years being considerate of each other. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, so something more complicated. Yes. That's— She let out a breath. That's almost funny. Almost. They sat with it for a moment. The absurdity of it, the waste of it, the specific, elaborate, self-defeating architecture of 2 people who had cared too much about the other's comfort to ever simply say what they needed. Then Jae-hyun leaned forward slightly in the chair, forearms still on his knees, and looked at her with the full weight of his attention and said, What do you need now? Amara felt the question land somewhere low and serious. I need to know, she said carefully, that what happened at the gala wasn't a moment. I need to know it wasn't about territory or ego or— She held his gaze. I need to know what it actually was. He didn't look away. It was jealousy. Yes? Irrational, probably. I am aware, he said, voice tightening slightly, that I have no right to be jealous. The arrangement has never— Stop. She said it quietly, but it cut through. Don't hide behind the arrangement. You came and knocked on my door at midnight and told me you couldn't sleep. Don't go back behind the arrangement now. His jaw tightened, then released. It was jealousy, he repeated. Stripped down, just the fact of it. I stood across that room and watched a man tell you he would marry you, and every part of me. He stopped. Something in his expression that she had never seen before and would think about for a long time afterward. I wanted to burn the room down. The air between them changed. Amara held very still. Okay, she said, soft. Okay. Neither of them moved for a moment. The lamplight was warm and the house was quiet, and somewhere outside the first suggestion of pre-dawn gray was beginning to dissolve the hard edges of the night. Then Jae-hyun stood, slowly, like a man who understood that the territory had shifted and was being careful with where he put his weight. He looked down at her sitting on the edge of the bed, and his expression was open in a way she didn't have a framework for yet. She would have to build one. "I'll let you sleep," he said. She almost laughed. "You knock on my door at midnight, say all of that, and now you're going to let me sleep. It's nearly 2. I'm aware of what time it is." He looked at her. Something in his eyes, the edge of something that might have been, in a different man, in a less armored man, amusement. "I don't want to push," he said. "Old habit." "I know." She stood too. They were closer now. The space between them collapsed to something that required a decision about what to do with it. "New habit," she said. "Don't go." He looked at her. "Not like that," she said before he could say anything. "Just sit. Talk to me. We have—" She gestured vaguely. "We have 2 years of nothing to cover." He looked at the chair, then at her. Something that was not quite a smile, but was in its neighborhood, moved across his face. He sat back down. She pulled her knees up and settled against the headboard, and they talked until the window went from black to gray to the pale, specific blue of early morning. And it was not dramatic, and it was not cinematic, and it was the most important conversation of her life. The days that followed were different. Not transformed. Not the clean, total renovation that happened in stories where the shift came all at once. Real change moved slower and stranger than that, and Jae-hyun Kang was not a man built for sudden openness. But the door was no longer closed, and that mattered more than either of them said out loud. Breakfast became the first thing. She came down at 7:15 on a Tuesday to find him already at the table with his coffee and his phone and his usual economy of presence, and she poured her coffee and sat down, and he didn't leave. That was new. He had always finished before she arrived, or arrived after she left. The scheduling precise enough that she had suspected it was intentional. Now, he sat across from her and they didn't talk much. Neither of them was built for morning conversation. But they were there, in the same room, at the same time. And it felt like something being rebuilt from the foundation. He started showing up, small things, barely perceptible to anyone who hadn't spent 2 years cataloging his absence. He appeared in the doorway of the sitting room when she was on a call with the foundation, not interrupting, just present for a moment before moving on. He rerouted a Saturday meeting so that he was home for dinner. He asked her, with no preamble and no apparent awareness of how unprecedented it was, whether she had a preference about the wine for the cabinet in the downstairs study, because he was reordering and he didn't want to duplicate what she didn't like. She stood in the kitchen where this question had been posed and looked at him for a long 3 seconds before answering. "I don't drink much red," she said. "I know." He was already typing something on his phone. "I meant white." She looked at the back of his head as he walked away and felt something move through her chest that she chose, carefully and deliberately, not to examine too closely. Not yet. She was not naive. She had spent enough time inside the Kang household to understand that its foundations were not entirely constructed of the things that appeared in legitimate business filings. She had known it from before she arrived, had made a decision, clear-eyed and adult, about what she could accept and what she could not, and had drawn lines accordingly. She didn't ask about the work. She didn't want the details that would make her complicit. But she was not ignorant, and ignoring a thing was different from not knowing it was there. What she was less prepared for was the knock on her office door, the small room on the second floor she'd converted into a workspace, on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the gala. She looked up. Jae-hyun stood in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, which was so far outside the established architecture of their dynamic that she genuinely thought for a moment she was misreading the scene. "You're working," he said. "Yes, I won't stay." He set one of the cups on the edge of her desk. "You had a call this morning that ran long. You didn't eat lunch." She looked at the tea, then at him. "How do you know I didn't eat lunch?" "Mrs. Park mentioned it." His housekeeper. "Of course." The kitchen noticed. Amara pressed her lips together. "You have your staff monitoring my eating habits. I have my staff doing their jobs." Something in his expression that was as close as he got to defensive. "Which includes making sure the people in this house are taken care of." "I'm not one of your—" She stopped herself, started again. "I'm capable of managing my own meals." "I know that." Even. Unruffled. "The tea is still there." He left. She looked at the tea for a long moment. It was the right kind. She preferred green, no milk, and she had never told him that. She had never told him because it had never seemed like information that belonged in the careful, bounded space their relationship had occupied. He knew anyway. She picked up the cup and held it with both hands and stared at her laptop screen and tried to remember why she had decided not to examine this too closely, and found she couldn't remember the reason anymore. 18 days after the gala, Min-jun came. She knew about Min-jun the way she knew about most of Jae-hyun's inner circle, partially, obliquely, through observed geography rather than direct introduction. Kang Min-jun was 37, Jae-hyun's cousin, and one of his 3 most senior lieutenants. He had a face that looked pleasant until you paid attention to it, at which point something underneath the pleasantness became apparent that recalibrated your assessment. She had seen him at 4 events. Jae-hyun had never introduced them. He arrived on a Thursday evening while Amara was in the garden. She heard the car on the drive and looked up from the book in her lap to see 2 men crossing toward the main entrance. Min-jun and someone she didn't recognize. She watched them go in without being seen. She went inside 20 minutes later to find Jae-hyun's study door closed, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the voices. Not loud enough to make out words, but with a quality, a register, that her body processed before her mind caught up. Something taut. Something being held at the edge of control. She went upstairs. An hour later, she heard the front door. Then Hae-hyun's footsteps on the stairs, and they had a different weight than usual. Heavier. Like a man carrying something. He knocked on her open office door. She looked up. He looked like someone had reached inside him and squeezed something. The surface was intact. It was always intact. But she could read the difference now. She had been learning to read the difference. "Something's happened," she said. "A complication." His voice was flat. "With business." She nodded. She didn't ask what kind. "It may affect the next few weeks." He was looking at her in a way that was hard to name, like he was trying to tell her something he didn't have permission to tell her. "I need you to know that whatever you see, whatever you hear, you're safe. This house is safe." "Jae-hyun, I mean it." "I know you mean it." She set her pen down. "That's not what I'm worried about." He looked at her. "I'm worried about you," she said. Something moved across his face, fast and undefended. She watched him absorb it, the specific, unfamiliar weight of being worried about. Watched him not know what to do with it. "I'll be fine," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the one I have." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she stood up, crossed the room, and stopped in front of him with less distance between them than she had permitted herself in 2 years. Close enough to see the tension in the line of his jaw. The slight redness at the edge of his eyes that told her the sleeplessness had been real and recent. "When this is resolved," she said, "I want you to tell me what happened. Not the details, just I want you to talk to me." He looked down at her, something in his expression that was almost anguish and almost something else entirely. "Amara, I'm not asking for what you can't give," she said. "I'm asking for what you can. That's all." His hand came up, slow, deliberate, and his fingertips touched her jaw, just the edge of it, just the angle of bone beneath her cheekbone. And it lasted perhaps 3 seconds before he lowered his hand and stepped back, and she felt the loss of it like a physical thing, immediate and specific. "I'll tell you when it's done," he said. He went back downstairs. She stood in her office doorway and listened to the house settle and thought about a man who showed love through tea left on desks and books left on tables, and a hand against her back in a crowded room, and thought about how very long it had taken her to recognize it for what it was. And thought about the fact that whatever complication had walked through that front door with Kang Min-jun, it was not finished. It was not close to finished. At 11:30 that night, her phone rang. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang again. She let it go. The third time something made her pick up. Silence on the other end. Then a voice. Male, Korean accent she didn't recognize. English chosen deliberately. "Mrs. Kang," the voice said. "You should ask your husband what he traded 2 years ago to make your marriage possible. Ask him what your uncle gave up. Ask him what you were actually brought here to secure." The line went dead. Amara sat in the dark with the phone in her hand. Her heart was very loud in the room. She sat there for a long time, not moving, while the words rearranged themselves in her mind, finding new configurations, each one worse than the last. The call could be nothing. A provocation. A threat designed to destabilize. The kind of psychological move she understood powerful men sometimes made against each other through the people around them. It could be nothing. She thought about her uncle's voice on the phone 3 years ago. The rawness in it. "I need this, Amara." She thought about how quickly Jae-hyun had agreed to the arrangement. Her family had told her the Kangs had been cautious, had required time to consider. She had believed it because it made sense. Why would a man like Jae-hyun Kang agree immediately to marry someone he didn't know? Why would he agree immediately? She set the phone face down on the nightstand. She would not go downstairs. Not tonight. Not with her hands shaking and her mind running calculations that might be entirely wrong and might be entirely right, and no way yet to know which. Tomorrow. She would ask tomorrow. She lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened, and somewhere below her, in the house, she heard his study door open. His footsteps in the corridor. They stopped outside her door. She waited. He didn't knock. After a long moment, she heard him move away. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would ask him what she had actually been brought here to. She was already awake when the light came. Not the slow, uncertain waking of someone pulled from deep sleep, but the sharp, immediate consciousness of a person who had not truly slept at all. She had lain in the dark for 4 hours with the phone face down on the nightstand and the voice on the other end of it playing on a loop in her head, finding new angles each time it cycled through. Ask him what you were actually brought here to secure. She got up at 6:15, washed her face, looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment, the specific, unflattering honesty of early morning light, no performance required. She looked like someone who had made a decision and wasn't sure yet whether it was brave or reckless. She went downstairs. Jae-hyun was already in the kitchen. This was new enough that it still registered as unusual, him being present in the morning spaces of the house, occupying the same air. He was standing at the counter with coffee, his back partially to her, reading something on his phone with the focused stillness of a man processing bad news and not letting it reach his face. He heard her, turned slightly. "You're up early," he said. "I didn't sleep." Something shifted in his expression. He set the phone down. "Amara, someone called me last night." She said it directly because there was no other way to say it. No version of this conversation that started gently and arrived somewhere honest. "Unknown number. They spoke in English. They told me to ask you what you traded 2 years ago to make our marriage possible." The kitchen was very quiet. Jae-hyun's face did not change. That was the thing. The surface of him did not move. And she had learned enough by now to know that the stillness was not absence of reaction. It was the opposite. It was a man holding something with both hands so it didn't show. "Who called?" he said. "I don't know. I don't recognize the number. I don't recognize the voice." She kept her eyes on him. "I'm not asking about the call. I'm asking about what they said." A pause. Long enough that she felt it in her chest. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his coffee cup down and turned to face her fully, and she saw it, the thing underneath the surface, finally unguarded. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated than guilt. Something that had been living in him for 2 years, waiting for this specific morning. "Your uncle's business," he said. 3 years ago, it was in trouble. She held very still. He had debts, not small ones, the kind that don't get resolved through banks or lawyers. His voice was even, measured, but she could hear the weight under it. He had borrowed from people who operated the way my family operates, and he had defaulted. The room felt very cold suddenly. "The debt was called in," Jae-hyun continued. "There were consequences discussed, serious ones." He paused. "My father intervened. He offered an alternative resolution." "The marriage," Amar said. "Yes." She said nothing. "Your uncle's debt was absorbed. His business was stabilized. 3 of his contracts that had been deliberately undermined were restored." Jae-hyun's jaw worked for a moment. "In exchange, the families agreed to a union. Your family brought legitimate international ties that benefited the Kang organization during a transition period. Your uncle brought you." The last 2 words landed like something dropped from a height. My uncle sold me, she said. That's not... Don't. The word came out sharp enough that he stopped. She pressed her hand flat against the counter beside her, kneaded the cold solidity of it. Don't soften it. Don't manage it. Tell me exactly what happened. Ye-hyun looked at her with an expression she had no name for. Your uncle made an arrangement to protect everything he had built. You were part of that arrangement. He believed, I think he genuinely believed, that the Kong family would provide stability, that you would be taken care of. Taken care of? She heard her own voice from a distance. Like an asset. Amara, did you know? She looked at him directly. When you agreed, did you know that my uncle was being coerced? That I was being offered as a settlement on his debt? The pause before he answered told her everything before the words did. Yes, he said. The kitchen tilted slightly. She gripped the counter. I knew the structure of the arrangement, he said, and his voice had changed, something raw in it now, stripped of the management. I knew your uncle owed a debt and that the marriage was proposed as resolution. I agreed to it. You agreed to it? Yes. Knowing I didn't know? Yes. She looked at him. This man she had spent 2 years learning. This man whose silences she had catalogued and whose small acts of consideration she had held close in the dark and allowed herself carefully, incrementally, to begin to trust. Why? She said. Not anger yet. Something beneath anger, something colder. He didn't look away from her. Because I had seen you. 8 months before the arrangement was proposed, you spoke at a development conference. International funding for rural healthcare infrastructure. You were the last speaker. The room had been losing attention for an hour. You stood up, and in 4 minutes you had everyone back. He paused. I remembered it. When my father proposed the arrangement, I thought about that room. I said yes because I already... He stopped. Because I already knew who you were. You knew who I was, she repeated slowly. So you agreed to acquire me. That's not what would you call it? Her voice cracked on the last word. Not tears. Something harder than tears. You watched me give a speech and decided you wanted me, and when an opportunity presented itself through my uncle's misfortune, you took it. You took it without telling me. You let me come here thinking I was doing something for my family, for someone I loved, and the whole time I was... She pressed her lips together. I was a transaction. I was the interest on a debt. No. Something broke open in his voice. That is not what you were to me. But it's what I was in the arrangement. That's the structure. That's what you agreed to. He had no answer to that, because there was no answer to that. The structure was the structure. She pushed off from the counter, walked to the window. The garden outside was silver gray in the early light, the roses reduced to their outlines, everything stripped of color and warmth. She stood with her back to him and breathed through the thing moving through her chest. Not clean emotion, not the kind that resolved itself quickly, the kind that required inventory, the kind you had to sit inside to understand its dimensions. My uncle called me, she said very quietly, 3 years ago. He said he needed this. He sounded... I had never heard him sound like that. I thought he was sick. I thought something was wrong with him physically. She paused. He was scared. He was trying to protect his business, and he was scared, and he called me, and I... She stopped. He used that voice on me, she said. He used the voice of a frightened old man, and I came. Behind her, Jae-hyun said nothing. She could feel him, could feel the weight of him not moving, not trying to fill the silence with something that would have been wrong. Does he know? She asked. Does my uncle know that I know? He doesn't know I told you. You didn't tell me. Someone else told me. She turned around. Who called me last night, Jae-hyun? Who has this number and this information and chose last night specifically to use it? Something changed in his expression. The rawness closed slightly. The other version of him coming forward, the one that ran the empire, the one that calculated threat in real time. Minjun came yesterday, he said. I know. I saw him arrive. There's a faction inside the organization that wants a renegotiation of certain arrangements, alliances that were structured under my father's leadership. His voice was careful now, precise. There are people who believe that the Kang organization, under my direction, has become, he chose the word deliberately, soft. Soft. that I've allowed personal interest to compromise operational priorities. She stared at him. They think you've gone soft because of me. He held her gaze. Some of them. And Min Jun is one of them. A pause that answered the question. Your cousin, she said. Your cousin called me at 11:30 at night to destabilize whatever was happening between us, to remind me that I was brought here as collateral. It's possible. Is it possible or is it true? It's true, he said. She absorbed this, the picture assembling itself with a speed and clarity that she would have preferred to resist, but she had always been better at seeing things as they were than as she wished them to be. It was the quality her professors had called her greatest strength, and her aunt had called exhausting, and that had served her well in every context of her adult life except, apparently, her own marriage. He wants to remove me, she said. Jae-hyun's expression tightened. Not physically, she said quickly. He wants me gone from this house, from the arrangement, because as long as I'm here, you're, what, distracted? Compromised? She looked at him. He's trying to use the truth of how I got here to make me leave on my own. Yes, Jae-hyun said, flat and certain. That's what he's doing. And if I leave on my own, what happens to the faction problem? It gets worse. He said it without softening. My ability to hold the organization together depends in part on the perception that my household is stable. A separation, especially a public one, would be read as weakness. It would accelerate the renegotiation demands. She nodded slowly. So I'm still an asset. Amara, I'm not saying it with anger, I'm saying it factually. She crossed her arms. Not defensive. The gesture of a woman building her own structure in real time, assembling the frame of the thing so she could walk around it and look at all sides. 2 years ago, I was an asset that stabilized a transition. Now I'm an asset that stabilizes your position against internal dissent. She looked at him. Is there a version of my presence in this house that isn't about what I provide to the Kang organization? The silence that followed was the longest one he had ever given her. She watched him stand in his own kitchen in the gray morning light and actually struggle. The man who had answers for everything, the man who controlled rooms and outcomes and people, standing in front of her without a prepared response, because the question had no clean answer, and he was too honest. She had learned this about him, he was ruthlessly honest, to offer her a dishonest one. Yes, he said finally. There is, but I understand that I have no way to prove that to you right now. I understand that everything I say in this room this morning is contaminated by what you just learned. Every feeling I've expressed in the last 3 weeks. He stopped. Started again. You have no way of knowing which parts were real and which parts were strategy. I know that. I can't fix that this morning. She looked at him for a long time. The book, she said. He blinked. What? The biography you left in the entry hall. The Economist. I mentioned her in a phone call 6 months ago. You left the book without a note. She held his gaze. Was that strategy? Something moved across his face. No. The tea. Last Thursday. You knew I prefer green. You knew without me telling you. She kept her voice level. Was that strategy? No. The Cho Foundation introduction. You made a call to help my work without telling me or taking credit. Her voice remained very steady. Was that? No. Rough now. The control fraying slightly at the edges. None of that was strategy. Then I need you to understand something. She uncrossed her arms, stood straight. I am furious with you. I am furious about the arrangement and about what was done to my uncle and what my uncle did and the fact that I came to this country to help someone I loved and the whole time I was being moved across a board. She held his gaze. I am furious and I need time with that, and you are going to give me that time. Yes. But I am not leaving. He went very still. Minjun called me to make me run, she said, and I don't run. Her chin lifted slightly. I was not brought into this situation with full information, and that is a wrong that needs accounting for. But I'm not going to let your cousin weaponize my anger to accomplish his goals. I make my own decisions about when I leave and when I stay. She looked at him with something in her eyes that was fury and something else, something harder to name, something that had been growing in the careful spaces of 2 years and was not going to be ended by one ugly morning. So, tell me about Mean June. Tell me what he actually wants. Tell me what's actually at stake. All of it. Jae-hyun looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was not relief. It was larger than relief. It was the look of a man who had spent years building walls to protect something and had just watched the thing he was protecting step out from behind the wall on its own feet. "Sit down," he said. "Last time you said that, I said I'd rather stand." "I know." He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table, set it at an angle. "Sit down anyway." She sat. He sat across from her. And he told her, Minjun's move was not impulsive. She understood that within the first 5 minutes. It had been months in the construction, carefully architected, drawing on alliances that had been quietly built over the last year across 3 of the Kang organization's regional branches. The call to Amara had been a test. Provoke a crisis in the household, monitor the response, assess whether Jae-hyun's attention would fracture under personal pressure. It was the kind of move that worked on most men. The kind that understood that the fastest way to destabilize a leader was to destabilize the thing he was protecting. What Minjun had not calculated, what Amara understood even as Jae-hyun was laying out the structure of it, was that the move had also handed them something. Knowledge, timing, a map of where the pressure was being applied and who was applying it. "He has 3 senior people," Jae-hyun said. "The Busan branch director, one of the financial structure leads, and someone inside the legal apparatus. I don't have a confirmed name yet. Someone inside your legal team." "Yes." "Which means they have access to documentation." He looked at her, a slight recalibration, seeing her in a different mode. "Yes, potentially." "What documentation would hurt you most if it moved?" He was quiet for a moment. "There are certain transfer structures. From the transition period after my father died. The reorganization was not clean. There were methods used that would be difficult to explain to outside parties." "Outside parties meaning law enforcement?" "Yes." She pressed her fingers together, looking at the table, thinking. "If Minjun has someone inside your legal team, and he's been building this for months, he may already have what he needs. The call to me was the opening move, not the preparation." She looked up. "You're not at the beginning of this. You're already in it." Jae-hyun looked at her with an expression that was very close to the one he'd worn when she'd first walked into the kitchen this morning. Something opened that he hadn't been planning to open. "I know. How long do you have?" "Days. Maybe a week before he makes a formal move within the organization." He paused. "If the documentation reaches anyone outside..." The sound hit the house before either of them registered what it was. Not loud, not the theatrical crash of fiction. A single sharp sound. Glass from somewhere on the ground floor. Then silence. Then the specific wrong quality of footsteps that were not the footsteps of the household staff. Jae-hyun was on his feet before she finished processing the sound. He moved to the kitchen doorway, his body shifting into something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness of a man in a boardroom, not the careful precision of their private conversations. Something older, instinctive. A man who had grown up in a world where the threat sometimes. Jae-hyun's hand came up. One gesture, flat palm toward her. Stay. She stayed. He moved through the kitchen doorway into the corridor with a silence that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size. But she understood now that this was who he actually was beneath the tuxedos and the measured boardroom stillness. This was the version of Kang Jae-hyun that the other version had been built to conceal. She stood in the kitchen with her pulse loud in her ears and her hands flat on the table and counted her own breaths. 1, 2. The footsteps she'd heard had stopped. The house had gone completely silent in the way that houses went silent when something wrong was inside them. Not the natural quiet of early morning, but the held breath silence of occupied space pretending to be empty. 3, 4, then voices. The corridor. 2 of them. Jae-hyun's and someone else's. Lower, rougher, speaking Korean too fast for her to track. Not shouting, worse than shouting. The controlled, pressurized register of men who were past the point of needing to perform threat because the threat was already real. She moved to the kitchen doorway. Jae-hyun was 6 feet down the corridor, facing a man she didn't recognize. Broad, mid-40s, with the particular physical density of someone who had spent decades using his body as a professional instrument. He was holding something at his side. She couldn't see it clearly in the corridor's dim light, but she didn't need to. Behind the first man, barely visible, a second shape in the entrance to the side hall. Two of them. Jae-hyun was talking. She couldn't track the Korean, but she could read the posture. He was not backing up. He was not raising his hands. He was standing exactly where he stood, as if the laws of physics had made a specific arrangement with him. His voice was low and even, and she caught one phrase repeated twice that she recognized from months of ambient language absorption. Malhebwa. Tell me. The broad man said something. Jae-hyun's head tilted slightly, the way it tilted when he was receiving information and filing it. Then the second man moved. What happened next was fast enough that she processed it as a sequence of separate images rather than continuous motion. Jae-hyun pivoting left, the second man's momentum carrying him into the space where Jae-hyun had been. Jae-hyun's elbow finding the back of the man's neck with a force that dropped him against the corridor wall. The broad man moving at the same time, something in his hand now catching the light. Not a gun, a blade, short and practical, and Jae-hyun catching his wrist with both hands, the impact of two bodies against the corridor wall, hard enough to send a painting crashing to the floor. Amara moved. Not toward the fight. Away from it, fast, to the kitchen drawer second from the left where she had noticed 8 months ago while looking for scissors that the household kept a phone, an old model, a backup, for power outages. She had filed the information away the way she filed everything away, not knowing why, and now she pulled the drawer open and found it exactly where she remembered. And her hands were shaking, but only slightly as she turned it on. She called Daijung. He answered on the second ring. She said 4 words. Main house, come now. She hung up. In the corridor, the sounds had changed. She went back to the doorway. The second man was down, not moving. The broad man was still standing, but barely. Jae-hyun had his arm locked at an angle that suggested the continued application of pressure would resolve the structural question permanently. They were both breathing hard. Jae-hyun's shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was blood at his temple. A cut, not deep, from something. The wall, the painting frame, she couldn't tell. He said something to the broad man in a voice she had never heard from him. Quiet and absolute and without any of the performance of threat because it needed none. The broad man's face changed. He talked. She couldn't follow it. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Jae-hyun listen and watched his face and tried to read what was being said from the architecture of his expression as it shifted, processing, calculating, arriving somewhere that made his jaw tighten and his eyes go very flat and still. Then he released the man's arm and stepped back and said one word. The broad man looked at him, looked at the corridor, looked at his associate on the floor. He left. Jae-hyun stood in the corridor for a moment with his back to her, his breathing audible, his hand against the wall. The cut at his temple had run a thin line of blood down to his jaw. Jae-hyun, he turned. Sit down, she said. First time she'd said it to him. He came into the kitchen. He sat. She found a clean towel, ran cold water on it, brought it to the table. He took it from her without a word and pressed it to his temple, and she sat across from him and waited. Minjun, he said. Those were his people. Yes. His voice was flat, processing. Not a move I expected yet. He accelerated. Because the call didn't work. She looked at him. He called me last night to make me leave, and I didn't leave, and he knew this morning that it hadn't worked. So he moved to the next stage. What was the next stage supposed to accomplish? Jae-hyun looked at the towel in his hand. Red at the center now. Pressure. A message. He wasn't trying to... He paused. They weren't here to kill anyone. They were here to demonstrate capability, to demonstrate that my house is accessible, that I can be reached. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to make me negotiate. Will you? He looked at her then. The cut still bleeding slightly, his shirt torn, the morning light coming through the kitchen window and making everything look very ordinary, despite the man on the corridor floor and the blade and the painting that had cost more than most people's cars lying in pieces against the baseboard. No, he said. The front door. Dae-jung, moving fast, two other men behind him. They took in the corridor, took in Jae-hyun, received instructions in low, rapid Korean, and dispersed. Dae-jung appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Amara with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not surprised, she noted. Not the expression of a man encountering something entirely unexpected. The expression of a man who had been waiting for something to escalate and was recalibrating his timeline. "The police," Amara said. Jae-hyun looked at her. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I know that's not how this works. I know that calling the police creates problems that are worse than the problem it solves." She held his gaze. "But I want you to hear me when I tell you that there is another option, and I need you to actually consider it. Not dismiss it, because it's not how things are done in this world. Actually, consider it." He was quiet, the towel against his temple, blood on his jaw. "Talk," he said. She took a breath. "Min-jun has documentation, or he believes he has documentation. Either way, the threat is the same. He's using it as leverage to force a renegotiation. He wants control, or he wants a settlement, and he's willing to burn you with outside exposure to get it." She looked at him. "But if the documentation reaches law enforcement before he controls the timing, if you go to them first with cooperation, with information they want more than they want you, you're describing an arrangement with prosecutors. I'm describing the one move he hasn't planned for, because it requires you to give up things voluntarily that he thinks you'd never give up." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "He knows how you operate. He grew up watching how the Kang organization operates. He has no framework for you walking into a prosecutor's office." Jae-hyun looked at her for a very long time. Outside, somewhere in the house, she could hear Dae-jung and the others moving, the specific sounds of cleanup, of a household resetting itself after violence, efficient and practiced and deeply wrong in its normalcy. "That path ends the organization," Jae-hyun said. "Parts of it. Most of it." "Yes." She didn't look away. "Is that the worst thing?" The question landed between them like something that had weight and heat. She watched him absorb it, watched the man who had inherited an empire from a father who built it through methods that didn't bear close examination, sit with the question of whether the empire was worth what it cost. "It's not your decision," she said quietly. "It's yours. It's entirely yours, and I know that. But you told me this morning that you wanted something real between us, and real means I tell you what I actually think." She paused. "And what I actually think is that Kang Min-jun is trying to take your life apart, and the one move he cannot counter is the one that takes it apart first, on your terms, in a direction he can't follow." Jae-hyun stood up. Slowly. He set the towel on the table and walked to the window and stood with his back to her and looked out at the garden where the roses were ending and the morning was fully arrived now, gray giving way to pale gold, and she watched the line of his back and waited. He turned around. "I need to make calls," he said. She nodded. "This will take most of the day." "I know." "Amara." He stopped. Something in his face that was complicated and open and more honest than anything she'd seen from him in 2 years. "What you said this morning, about staying, about making your own decisions about when you leave." He held her gaze. "I need to know that stands. After everything. After this." He gestured slightly, encompassing the corridor, the blood, the morning's accumulated damages. She looked at him. This man she was furious with. This man whose small, careful acts of consideration she had been quietly cataloging for 2 years. This man standing in a torn shirt with blood on his jaw, asking her if she was still there. "Make your calls," she said. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he moved. The day was long and ugly, and she spent most of it in her office with the door closed, working through what needed working through, her own anger, which required space and honesty rather than suppression, and the practical reality of what came next, which required clear thinking rather than feeling. She called her uncle at noon. He answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been waiting. "Amara, I know," she said, flat, clean. "I know everything." The silence on his end was long enough that she had to resist the urge to fill it. "I'm not calling to fight," she said finally. "I'm calling because I need you to understand that I know. And because whatever happens next, you need to be prepared for changes." She paused. "Are you safe?" A sound from him. Something that might have been a breath, or might have been something smaller and more broken. Yes, good. She held the phone very still. I love you. That hasn't changed. But we are going to have a very long conversation when this is over, and you are going to answer everything I ask you. Every single thing. Yes, he said. Very quiet. Yes, Amara. She hung up. She sat in the chair in her office for a while after that. Not working, just sitting, with the Seoul skyline visible through the window and the sounds of the house around her, and the specific difficult weight of being a person who had been moved across a board without her knowledge, and who had decided, deliberately and clear-eyed, not to let that be the end of her story. At 4 in the afternoon, Jae-hyun appeared in her doorway. He looked like a man who had spent 6 hours in the kind of conversations that cost something. The cut at his temple had been cleaned and closed, small, precise, almost invisible now. He had changed his shirt. He looked exhausted in a way the surface of him couldn't fully contain. Sit down, she said, the second time she'd said it to him today. He sat in the reading chair, the one that had become, without either of them planning it, his chair in her office. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. I reached out to a contact, he said. Someone I've maintained a relationship with for years as insurance, federal level. There are things they want, specific people, specific structures that operate above the Kang organization, things my father built relationships with that I never... He stopped. I have information that is of significant value to them, more value than any prosecution of me. A cooperation agreement, the framework of one. It will take weeks to negotiate the details. There will be things given up that can't be recovered. He looked up at her. The organization as it currently exists won't survive it. But you will. The legitimate holdings will survive. The construction interests, the real estate structure, several of the international partnerships. He paused. It's not nothing. No, she said. It's not nothing. Minjun will know within 48 hours that the approach has been made. Once he knows, he exhaled. He'll move to accelerate. He'll try to get the documentation to his contacts before I complete the cooperation framework. He has a window, and he knows it. How do we close the window? He looked at her. Though we landed between them, and she saw him register it, the specific, particular weight of it. The person inside my legal team, he said. I have a name now, the man who came this morning. He gave me more than Minjun intended. Something in his expression that was cold and precise. I know who it is, and I know where the documentation is being held. Can you get to it? With help. He held her gaze. I need someone Minjun won't expect, someone outside the organization, someone who can make contact with the legal team member in a context that doesn't trigger his surveillance of my people. She understood what he was asking before he finished. You want me to go, she said. I want you to understand what I'm asking first. I understand what you're asking. Amara, where? Flat, direct. Where is this person and what do I need him to give me? Jae-hyun looked at her for a long moment, the exhaustion in his face, the cut at his temple, the careful, open, unguarded expression of a man who had spent 2 years hiding what he felt and was finished with that particular habit. His name is Lim Tae-woo, he said. He works out of an office building in Mapo. He's expecting pressure from my side. He is not expecting... His jaw tightened. He is not expecting you. What does he want? Safety. That's what Minjun promised him. A clean exit if the documentation moved. He leaned forward slightly. I can offer him something better, but I need him to believe it comes from someone who isn't me. Because if it comes from you, it looks like coercion. Yes. She stood up, walked to her closet, pulled out her coat, dark, professional, the one she wore to foundation meetings. She started putting it on. The documents, she said, physical copies or digital? Both. The physical copies are at his office. The digital, he has a drive. He keeps it on his person. If I can get him to agree to the cooperation framework, he brings both sets in himself, voluntarily, which changes the entire legal architecture of how they're received. He was on his feet now. Amara, if this goes wrong, tell me how to reach your contact, she said. The federal one, I want a name, in case. His jaw worked. Then he gave it to her, watched her put the name in her phone. "There's something else," he said. She looked up. His face was doing the thing it had done in the kitchen doorway 3 weeks ago. The thing she hadn't had a name for. The thing that looked like a man holding something with both hands. Except now it was different. Now the hands were open. "When this is over," he said, "when this is done and the structure is settled and there's ground under us again." He stopped. Started again. "I want to start over. I don't know how to say this differently. I want to court you, properly, on terms that are yours. No arrangement, no debt. No structure that was built for someone else's reasons." He held her gaze. "I want you to choose, knowing everything. I want it to be a choice." The coat was half on. She stood in her office with soul gray and bright through the window and looked at this man, this complicated, armored, quietly devastating man, and felt the thing she had been refusing to examine move through her chest with a force that took her breath. "Ask me again," she said. "When it's over." "I will." She finished putting on her coat. "The address," she said. He gave it to her. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. "Jae-hyun." He looked at her. "The cut on your temple," she said. "When I get back, let me look at it properly." Something moved across his face, small and real and completely unguarded. "Okay," he said. She walked out. The elevator, the lobby. The afternoon air of Seoul cold and sharp against her face as she stepped outside and found the car, found Dae-jung already waiting without being called, and understood that some things in this household ran on a frequency she didn't need to explain herself to. She got in. The city moved around her, massive and indifferent and full of the particular noise of millions of lives that had nothing to do with hers. She sat in the back of the car with her hands in her lap and her breathing steady, and thought about what she was walking into, and thought about Jae-hyun standing in her office doorway saying, "I want you to choose," and thought about all the ways the next 2 hours could go badly. Then she stopped thinking about all of that and focused. Lim Tae-woo's building was in Mapo, 20 minutes west, a glass and steel corporate structure, the kind that housed 40 different companies and asked no questions. His office was on the 11th floor. She knew from what Jae-hyun had told her that he worked late on Thursdays, that he had a secondary exit through the parking structure that he'd been using for the past month, which told her he was already scared, already watching for something to come. What came was going to be her. She checked her phone, one message from Jae-hyun sent in the last 5 minutes. 3 words. "Be careful. Please." She put the phone in her coat pocket. The building appeared through the windshield, glass and steel, and the ordinary face of a city that held extraordinary things in its ordinary containers. Dae-jung pulled to the curb. She opened her door. "Wait here," she said. "Mrs. Kang? Wait here." Firm. She met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "If I'm not out in 45 minutes, call the number I'm going to text you right now." She sent him the federal contact's name and number. Then she got out of the car, crossed the pavement, pushed through the building's glass doors into the lit interior, and found the elevator without breaking stride. 11th floor. The doors opened. The corridor was corporate and quiet. The end-of-day emptying already underway, a few people moving toward the exit with coats and bags. She walked the length of it to the door marked with the name of the legal firm and pushed it open without knocking. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help?" "I need to speak with Lim Tae-woo." She said it in English because it was the register Minjun's people wouldn't expect, the register that signaled something outside the established architecture of threat. "Tell him it's about the documents. Tell him I'm not from Kang Jae-hyun." She held the woman's gaze. "Tell him I'm his way out." The receptionist stared at her, then picked up the phone. 30 seconds of low conversation. A pause. The receptionist looked up with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, uncertainty edged with something that might have been relief on behalf of someone else. "He'll see you," she said. Amara crossed the reception area to the inner office door and put her hand on the handle and took one breath, slow, deliberate, the kind that settled things, and pushed it. Lim Tae-woo was smaller than she expected. She had built a picture of him on the drive over. A man who had chosen the wrong side out of ambition, someone hard-edged and calculating, the kind of person who looked at a loyalty and saw only its market value. What she found instead was a man in his mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago, and the particular exhausted pallor of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He was standing behind his desk when she came in, which told her he'd needed the desk between them before he could agree to the meeting. Scared. Already scared. She closed the door behind her. He looked at her. The full assessment, quick and practiced, the way lawyers looked at people they were trying to categorize before the conversation began. She watched him not find a category that fit. "You're his wife," he said. "Yes." He sent his wife. He didn't send me. She sat down across from him without being invited. Deliberate, she needed the body language to signal that she was not a messenger. "I came because I wanted to. That distinction matters." She set her hands on her desk, palms flat, nothing concealed. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you say anything else. Are you listening?" He sat down slowly. "I'm listening. Minjun promised you safety, a clean exit. He told you that if the documentation moved at the right time to the right people, you'd be outside the blast radius when everything came down." She held his gaze. "That's not what happens to people who help dismantle Kang Jae-hyun. That's what he told you happens. The actual outcome, the one he didn't describe, is that you become the most useful loose end in the entire structure. The person who moved the documentation. The person who can be pointed to." She paused. "Minjun doesn't need you safe. He needs you functional until he doesn't, and then he needs you quiet." Lim Tae-woo's jaw tightened, a muscle working near his temple. "You've thought about this," she said. "Not a question. You've been thinking about it for weeks. That's why you're using the parking structure exit. That's why the coffee on your desk is cold. You've been sitting here since the call this morning trying to decide whether you made the right bet. You don't know what—" "You have a daughter," she said, quietly. No aggression in it. "She's studying architecture at Yonsei. She graduates in the spring." He went very still. "I'm not saying that as a threat," she said, and meant it completely. "I'm saying it because I need you to understand that I know you're not a man without stakes. You did this for reasons. People always have reasons." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a different outcome, one where you walk out of this with your name attached to cooperation rather than conspiracy, where your daughter graduates in the spring and you're there to watch it." Tae-woo looked at her for a long time. "Kang Jae-hyun is not a man who forgives," he said. "No," she agreed. "He's not. But he's a man who honors agreements. There's a difference, and it matters more right now." She reached into her coat pocket and placed a card on the desk. The Federal Contacts information, which she'd transferred to a clean card from her wallet on the elevator ride up. "This person is expecting a call. Tonight, if possible. The cooperation framework being built has room for additional participants who come voluntarily. That room closes the moment Minjun moves, which he will do within 48 hours. Tae-woo looked at the card. He didn't touch it yet. "The documents," he said, "brought in by you, directly, voluntarily, which changes everything about how they're received and what they're used for." She held his gaze. "You're not a target in this version, you're a witness." The office was quiet. Through the window behind him, Seoul was going amber and gray in the early evening. The city shifting into its night register. A million lit windows appearing one by one across the skyline. He reached out and picked up the card. She exhaled once. Controlled. Didn't let it show. "I'll need until morning," he said. "You have until morning." She stood. "Call that number tonight. Tell them I sent you. They'll verify." She buttoned her coat. "Mr. Lim?" He looked up. "Minjun didn't account for the possibility that someone inside your position might actually want a way out that didn't end badly." She met his eyes. "That's his failure. Use it." She walked out. The elevator down. The lobby. The glass doors opening onto the cold evening air, and Dae-jung at the curb exactly where she'd left him. She got into the car and sat back and let her hands shake for approximately 30 seconds, which was the amount of shaking she decided to permit, and then she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed through it until they stopped. Her phone was ringing before Dae-jung pulled away from the curb. Jae-hyun. "It's done," she said. A pause. Just a breath. on his end. Then, "Are you all right?" "Yes." "I'm all right." He took the contact information. He said he needs until morning. She looked out the window at the moving city. "He's scared enough to do the right thing. That's all we needed." "Come home," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes. The drive back was 40 minutes, and she spent most of it watching Seoul rearrange itself from the commerce of day into the more honest version of itself that came with dark. The light different, the traffic different, the sense of a city doing what it actually did when the performance was over. She thought about Tae-woo's face when she mentioned his daughter. She thought about her uncle's voice on the phone. "Yes, Amara." Very quiet. The voice of a man who had known for 3 years that the accounting was coming. She thought about Jae-hyun in the kitchen this morning, with a towel at his temple and blood on his jaw, asking her if she was still there. The estate gates opened as the car approached. The gardens and the pathway lights. The main house windows lit from within, warm against the dark. He was at the front door when she came up the steps, not waiting with performance, not the posed stillness of a man who had rehearsed his relief into something presentable. Just standing in the doorway in shirt sleeves with his hands loose at his sides, and when she reached the top step, he looked at her face with the specific, searching attention of someone conducting a rapid private inventory. "The cut," she said. "Amara. I told you I'd look at it when I got back. Let me look at it." Something moved through his expression. He stepped back to let her in. She led him to the kitchen, the room that had become, without anyone deciding it, the room where the real things happened in this house, and sat him on a stool at the counter and found the first aid kit in the cabinet she'd located months ago and never used. She stood in front of him and examined the closed cut at his temple. Clean. Someone had done it properly. She cleaned the surrounding skin anyway, carefully, because her hands needed something precise to do. He sat very still. Let her. "Tae-woo will call tonight," she said, working. "He'll bring the documents in tomorrow. The cooperation framework should be able to absorb the timing. My contact confirmed the structure this afternoon. 3 hours of calls." His voice was low. She was close enough to feel the warmth of him. "The agreement protects the legitimate holdings, the construction interests, the real estate, 4 of the international partnerships." A pause. "Significant portions of what my father built will be handed over. Names, structures, financial flows going back 15 years. And Min-jun becomes a subject rather than a participant. He loses the leverage the moment Tae-woo walks in voluntarily." His jaw moved. She felt it beneath her fingertips. The controlled anger of a man who had grown up with someone, trusted someone, and been moved against by them. "He underestimated how much I was willing to give up. He thought you'd protect the empire at any cost. He knew me when the empire was the only thing I was protecting." His eyes found hers, steady, direct. Things changed. She finished with the cut, stepped back, returned the supplies to the kit. "My uncle," she said. She turned to face him. "Whatever arrangement was made with his debt, whatever he agreed to, I need it dissolved. Not renegotiated, dissolved. Whatever he owes to whatever remains of the Kang organization after the cooperation agreement, I need it gone." Jae-hyun looked at her. "Done. Just like that. Just like that." She looked at him for a moment. Why was it ever any other way? He was quiet. The honest quiet. "Because my father structured it as insurance, a continued obligation tied to your presence here. If you left, the debt reinstated." He held her gaze. "I didn't design it, but I maintained it. I should have dissolved it in the first year." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I know." She nodded slowly, looked at the counter, the first aid kit sitting there, the kitchen around them, the same kitchen where she'd been standing with cold hands and shaking certainty at 7 this morning when the whole architecture of the last 2 years had cracked open. 12 hours. The day had lasted approximately 40 years. "I need to eat something," she said, "and then I need to sleep. And tomorrow is going to be another very long day." She looked at him. "But before any of that, you want to finish the conversation," he said. "We have about 14 conversations still outstanding, yes." Something in his expression, not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. "I know." The fact that you already knew about me before the arrangement. She said it evenly, not reopening it to wound, reopening it because it needed complete air all the way through. That you saw me speak and made a decision about me before I ever had the chance to make one about you. Yes, that was wrong. Yes. And the way you've been, she searched for the word, providing, the tea, the book, the foundation introduction. All of it done in silence, without ever letting me know you were doing it, without ever giving me the information I needed to actually understand what I was living inside of. She looked at him directly. You were caring for me in a language I didn't have the translation for, and that cost us 2 years. Yes, his voice was rough. I know that. I'm not, she pressed her lips together. I'm not cataloging this to punish you. I'm saying it because if we are going to do what you said this morning, if you're going to actually court me, whatever that looks like now at this point after everything, then I need the language to be spoken out loud from here forward. I cannot navigate silence and implication for another 2 years. I understand. I need the actual words. He looked at her. The kitchen light. The cut at his temple. The man inside the empire, inside the careful, controlled performance of Kang Jae-hyun, looking at her without any of the layers. I was in love with you, he said, before you arrived. I want to be precise about that because the imprecise version sounds like obsession, and it wasn't. It was, I saw who you were in a room full of people performing who they wanted to be, and you were just being yourself. And I knew in a way I couldn't argue with that you were someone I wanted to know. I agreed to the arrangement because it was the only door available. He paused. That was a selfish thing. I understand that now in a way I didn't then. She held his gaze. And then you arrived, he continued, and you were more than I'd expected, which I hadn't thought was possible. And I kept my distance because I didn't trust myself to be near you without wanting things I hadn't earned. His voice was very steady, but underneath it something was working. I thought I was being careful. I thought I was protecting your freedom. I understand now that I was also protecting myself from the possibility that you wouldn't want me back. The kitchen was very quiet. Kang Jae-hyun, she said. Yes. That is possibly the most honest thing any person has ever said to me. Something moved across his face. It's easier when you've already lost the option of pretending. Is that what today did? Today. He exhaled. Today took everything I thought I was managing and showed me what it actually looked like from the outside. He looked at his hands for a moment. You walked into a building tonight, alone, without any structure or protection from my world, to talk a frightened man into doing the right thing. You did it because it was the logical move, and because you'd already decided that whatever this is between us was worth the risk. He looked up. I have ordered men to do difficult things for 20 years. I have never watched someone walk toward difficulty voluntarily and felt what I felt watching you get into that car. What did you feel? Terrified, flat, honest, and certain. For the first time in a very long time, completely certain. She looked at him. This man she was still angry with. Not as much as this morning, anger burned through faster when it was acknowledged cleanly. And this man she had been quietly, helplessly, inconveniently falling toward for 2 years in a house where falling had not been part of the arrangement. I'm not there yet, she said carefully. I want to be honest with you about that. What happened this morning, my uncle, the structure, all of it, I've processed it faster than most people would because I was always better at processing than feeling, but the feeling is still in there, and it needs time. She held his gaze. But I'm not leaving, and I am, she stopped, breathed. I am not indifferent to you. I want to be clear about that too. That's enough, he said. And he meant it. She could see that he meant it absolutely. Okay? She looked at the kitchen, at the ordinary domestic space where the two of them had somehow conducted the most important negotiations of both their lives. Now I'm going to make something to eat because it's been 12 hours since either of us had a real meal, and you're going to sit there and keep me company, and we are going to talk about something that has absolutely nothing to do with any of this. He blinked. Such as? I don't know, something normal. Tell me something normal about yourself. Tell me. She moved to the refrigerator. Tell me about the roses. You were looking at them yesterday morning. You said they'd come back. A pause behind her. My mother planted them, he said. Before she left. I was 11. He paused. I've had them maintained since I took over the estate. I don't know exactly why. She stood with her hand on the refrigerator and felt the weight of it. The specific human weight of a detail that contained a whole history. She didn't turn around. She gave him the privacy of not being looked at when he said it. They're beautiful, she said. I've thought so since the first week. She heard him exhale. I know, he said. I saw you looking. She smiled at the interior of the refrigerator where he couldn't see it. Then she started pulling things out, and he stayed on the stool, and they talked about nothing important for the first time in 2 years, and it was the most significant thing that had happened all day. Lim Tae-woo called the federal contact at 11:17 that night. She knew because Jae-hyun's phone lit up at 11:40 with a message from his contact confirming the call had been received. He showed her the screen without commentary. She nodded. They were sitting in the downstairs sitting room by that point, not the formal room used for his business meetings, the smaller one on the west side that she had quietly made habitable over 18 months with better lamps and a rug. She'd selected herself in books that were actually being read. They were on opposite ends of the sofa with a reasonable distance between them, and she was half through the biography she'd abandoned on her nightstand 3 weeks ago, and he was reviewing documents on his laptop with the focused, quiet efficiency of a man closing things down rather than building them up. It was, she thought, the most ordinary evening they had ever spent. In the morning, the machine moved. Tae-woo arrived at the federal building at 9 a.m. with a lawyer and both sets of documentation. She knew this from a call to Jae-hyun at 9:40. She was at the foundation by then, sitting across from Director Lim in the morning meeting she hadn't canceled because canceling would have required an explanation she didn't have the bandwidth to construct, and she received the information as a text and looked at it under the table and felt something in her chest release a pressure she hadn't fully registered was there. Min-jun was detained for questioning at 10:15. Jae-hyun spent most of the day at meetings she was not part of and did not ask about. This was their arrangement going forward, and it was one she had decided on deliberately. She would not be embedded in the operational reality of what the Kang organization was dismantling itself into. She would be adjacent to it, as she had always been, but with the full knowledge now of what adjacency meant and the clear-eyed choice to remain there anyway, on her own terms. He called her at 3. It's moving, he said. The cooperation framework is accepted. The documentation Tae-woo brought corroborates the financial structures we provided. Min-jun's position is a pause. He has no position anymore. And you, insulated, significantly. His voice was controlled, but she could hear something underneath it. Relief, exhausted and real, the sound of a man who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and was finally setting it down. There will be ongoing processes, months of them. It won't be clean. It doesn't have to be clean, she said. It has to be done. Yes. She was standing outside the foundation building, the afternoon cold sharp and clarifying against her face. The Seoul street moved around her. Taxis, pedestrians, the specific beautiful indifference of a city that had no awareness of and no interest in what had just reorganized itself in its middle distance. Come home at a reasonable hour, she said. A pause. The kind that had warmth in it. Yes, he said. 3 weeks later, her uncle came to Seoul. She met him at a restaurant. Not the estate, not yet, that would come later. She needed the restaurant's neutral ground for this particular conversation. He was older than she'd realized, or maybe she was seeing him differently now, with the knowledge of what he'd done sitting between them like furniture she had to navigate around. He was already at the table when she arrived. He stood up when he saw her. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing something and knew it wasn't going to be adequate. She sat down. Tell me, she said. Everything. From the beginning. He told her. It took 90 minutes and 2 courses, neither of them ate much of, and it was harder to hear than she'd expected, which was saying something because she had expected it to be very hard. The debt had been real and catastrophic and fast. Bad investments, worse advice, the specific ruthless speed with which certain kinds of trouble multiplied. The men who came to collect were not the kind who offered payment plans, and the Kang family's intervention had been framed to him as generosity, as family, almost, as a solution that would hurt no one. He was a child, her uncle said. He meant Jae-hyun. When I met him, 20-something, I thought he stopped, looked at his hands. I thought he was cold. I thought he was his father's instrument. I didn't think he stopped again. He wasn't cold, she said. That was the mistake everyone made. Her uncle looked at her. His eyes were wet, which was a thing she had never seen, and she found it harder to stay angry at a man whose eyes were wet than she had anticipated. I'm not going to tell you it's fine, she said. It's not fine. You made a decision about my life without my knowledge, and it wasn't yours to make. She held his gaze. And I'm going to be angry about that for a while longer. I need you to understand that and not try to resolve it prematurely. Yes, he said, but, she exhaled. You are 70 years old and you were terrified and you made a choice you've been living with for 3 years and it did not. She stopped, found the honest version of it. It didn't destroy me. What I built inside that arrangement turned out to be real. I don't fully understand that yet, but it's true. He looked at her. Are you happy? The words sat there, simple and enormous. I'm getting there, she said. That's more than I could have said 6 months ago. He reached across the table, put his hand over hers. She let him. They sat like that for a while, in the quiet of the restaurant, with the city outside going about its enormous ordinary life. The night she would think of afterward as the real beginning, not the gala, not the midnight knock, not the morning of the cut and the kitchen and the terrible honest accounting, was a Tuesday in November, 8 weeks after everything had cracked open and begun to heal into a different shape. It was cold. The garden was done for the season, the roses reduced to bare architecture, waiting for spring. She was in the sitting room with a book she wasn't reading, and she heard him come in from the city, and she heard him pause outside the room. The small, human pause of a man checking whether the light was on. It was on. He came in, set his coat over the chair, loosened his tie, which he still wore even though the empire it belonged to was substantially renegotiated now, a different structure, lighter, more honest in its bones if less powerful in its reach. He sat on the other end of the sofa. He picked up the book on the side table. She had left it there 2 days ago. The one about the Kenyan economist, dog-eared at page 212, and looked at where she'd stopped. Good? He asked. She's brilliant, she said. I should have read it a year ago. I should have left it a year ago. She looked at him. He was looking at the book, something easy in his face that had never been there before, or had been there and hidden, and was now simply present. Jae-hyun. He looked up. You said you wanted to court me. She held his gaze. Properly. On my terms. Yes. I've been thinking about what that means. She set her own book down, turned toward him slightly. I think it means this. What we're already doing. Breakfasts, evenings, talking about things that matter and things that don't. Learning each other without a structure telling us what we're supposed to be to each other. She paused. I think courtship, at this point, looks like Tuesday nights on this sofa. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight. The room she had made habitable because she had decided to stay and make things habitable. The sole night pressing soft and dark against the windows. I can do that, he said. I know you can. She turned back to her book. He opened his. The room settled around them, warm and quiet and honest in the way that only spaces can be when the people inside them have stopped pretending to be less complicated than they are. After a while, without looking up from her page, she moved slightly closer. Not dramatically, just the 3 or 4 inches that changed the quality of the distance between them. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. But she felt the change in him. The specific, careful, absolutely genuine quality of a man receiving something he had wanted for a very long time and was determined not to mishandle. She read her page. He read his. Outside, Seoul shimmered against the dark sky, vast and luminous and entirely indifferent to the small, enormous fact of 2 people on a sofa who had wasted 2 years being careful and were now, finally, choosing something different. The roses would come back in spring. She already knew she would be there to see them, and so would he.